try to keep a Swiss schedule, like, you know, in Switzerland, trains leave on time, usually arrives on time. The question is what happens in between, and if you want to have a good narrative, probably you can get lost a little bit, not going a straight line. I just have to also explain that here I'm not going to come here with a strong personal claim arguments about like what narratology is or should be, but I have a more modest aim that is just like trying to draw a map of a little part of narratological concerns, namely virtualities. And I'll be a bit in the maze, but basically I draw this map because I want to know where I got lost in the maze, and maybe you can find where you are too. Okay, so I begin now, and I just want to begin with the idea that nowadays I think it's become almost impossible to deal with central issues for narrative theory such as narrative sequence, plot, tellability, narrative interest, or even narrativity without investigating how the story is embedded in a complex network of virtual fabulas. By contrast, I think that these questions had been largely neglected in formalist or structuralist theories that David Herman called classical. So begin with David Herman, and he said in a book published in 2002 that the approach of Prof gave an overly deterministic coloration to narrative sequences. Part of the interest and complexity of narrative depends on the merely probabilistic and not deterministic links between some actions and events. On the same line, Hilary Dannenberg, in a book edited by John Pierre here, said that an analysis of narrative story tells us very little about the true dynamics of plot and about the fascination of fictional worlds for the reader. This stems from the fact that narrative does not simply tell one story, but weaves a rich ontologically multi-dimensional fabric of alternate possible worlds. Thus, with the emergence of the analysis of alternate possible worlds as a central field of investigation, narratology has departed from its original formalist paradigm, and it has overcome also its methodological limitations. As pointed out by Emma Kafalenos in an attempt to describe the evolution of contemporary narratology, recent studies tend to highlight more the role of the reader and the indeterminations of the narrative. Yeah. She says, what I see new in is a specificity, she said, what I see new in contemporary narratology is a specificity of the analysis of how readers' decisions contribute to the construction of the narrative world. Further developments along this path, if it occurs, will bring us an increasingly precise account of sites where indeterminacy can enter a narrative representation and of conditions that heighten the interactivity between representation and reader in constructing narrative worlds. But if this evolution can be seen as a general trend in narrative theory, and if the analysis of alternate possible worlds appears at first sight as a coherent field of investigation, we can question the unity of this field, as well as the complementary or convergent nature of theories dealing with it. Thus, in reviewing the different ways in which the question of narrative virtualities have been dealt with, offers a good opportunity, I hope, to describe the actual state of narrative theory, or at least a part of it. By doing so, I shall try to highlight the forces at play, those encouraging consolidation of the discipline, or conversely, those pushing toward diversification. That explains the tendency sometimes to talk about narratologies. Well, I will begin now to shortly describe a short story of Borges, The Garden of Forking Paths, in order to illustrate the various ways we can deal with the virtualities of a narrative. This short story can be considered as a meta-narrative and as a spy story as well. And both aspects will be useful for the discussion, I think. On the meta-narrative side, Borges refers to the work of Cui Pen, a Chinese ancestor of the protagonist, who is supposed to have written a book titled The Garden of Forking Paths. This book is described as a maze and as a labyrinth of time. In the fiction, Professor Stefan Albert explains that in all fictional works, each time a man is confronted with several alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the others. In the fiction of Cui Pen, he chooses simultaneously all of them. He creates, in this way, diverse futures, diverse times, which themselves also proliferate and fork. So the book of Cui Pen, on the work of Borges, has often been associated to the characteristics of interactive storytelling that has been discussed in different panels here, especially to hypertext fictions and digital media. Indeed, in these kinds of narratives, all the alternatives have been programmed or written in some ways, and they fully belong to the structure of the work, even though the reader or the player actualizes only one path, leaving the other path unexplored. Still, we can notice that the book of Cui Pen is defined as a novel, so I'm not going to talk that much of interactive storytelling. And the author of this book, Cui Pen, also, though his narrative is a weird one, is described probably an unnatural one that would interest Brian Richardson, is described as a kind of novelist. And also Borges highlights the fact that alternatives belong to all fictional texts. Even though these alternatives are not textualized, they can still be considered in imagination, both for the character planning his next move and for the reader wondering how the narrative is going to develop. In consequence, it is perfectly possible to state that all narratives, as there are representations of actions realized by characters and addressed to an audience, are interactive in some ways and comprise alternative paths. Now let's move to the spy story side of the tale. This narration recounts a fictional event happening during the First World War. I think that everybody knows this fiction, but anyway, I'm going to summarize it very quickly. The story is a homodiegetic narration, and it is supposed to be the fragment of a deposition, and I quote, dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Yu Tsun, a former professor of English at the Hochschule at Tsingtao. Yu Tsun is also a Chinese spy working for the Germans, and when the story begins, he is about to be arrested by Captain Richard Madden, an Irishman working for the British government. After discovering that his accomplice, Victor Runeberg, has been uncovered, Yu Tsun loses all hopes to save his life, but he decides to accomplish one final mission. He succeeds in communicating the name of a place where the English artillery is located, a city called Albert. In order to fulfill his mission, Yu Tsun kills a man whose name is Dr. Stephen Albert. So the assassination of Dr. Albert is reported by the newspapers and therefore transmitted to the German authorities. Unfortunately for Yu Tsun, his victim turns out to be a friendly man and a sinologist who is working on the work of Cui Pen, one of his ancestors. That's why, at the end of the story, the Chinese spy concludes his confession by stressing that he has worn out abominably, and he expresses his contrition and weariness. The story of Borges not only reflects on narrative virtualities, but it also actualizes all kinds of virtual worlds that we can find in a narrative. We can begin our survey of these different kind of virtualities with the kind of virtualities that seem closer to the reflection developed by Thomas Pavel. At this stage, we can consider the narrative world as a whole, and not in its progressive actualization. Umberto Eco, who has worked on the same issue, insists on the fact that even if possible words are actualized through a series of different stages, all these moments ultimately belong to one same possible world, as the author had planned it. A possible world in an assertive mode that must be contrasted with other possible worlds imagined by the characters of the story or by the readers. So modal logic provides useful tools to explain how fictional worlds are shaped based on information we process concerning the real world. Here, in the frame of a phenomenology of the reading, for example, the possible must be considered as a parasite of the actual. Marie-Laure Ryan explains, for example, that when readers construct fictional worlds, they fill in the gaps of the text by assuming the similarity of the fictional world to their own experiential reality. This model can only be overruled by the text itself. Thus, if a text mentions a blue deer, the reader will imagine an animal that resembles her idea of a real deer in all respects other than the color. Of course, we know that the fictional characters are human beings endowed with attributes that don't have to be mentioned, like, for example, the fact that they have usually 2 arms, 2 legs, and so on. But we also receive relevant information that characterize them. For example, we learn that the antagonists in this story are Chinese and Irish, and both are working for possible enemies, namely the Germans and the English governments. We can also infer information from the first line. We read that on page 22 of Little Hart's History of the World War I, you will read that an attack against the Serre-Montauban line by 13 British divisions, supported by 1,400 artillery pieces, planned for the 24th of July 1916, had to be postponed until the morning of the 29th. The torrential rains, Captain Little Hart comments, caused this delay, an insignificant one to be sure. Then we read the following statements dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Yutsun, former professor of English, throws an unsuspected light over the whole affair. Here, we should not wonder whether the book of Little Hart truly exists, or what is truly written on page 22 of this book. But what matters here is that what we should infer from the mention of the history book based on what we know concerning the real world. By mentioning a well-known historical context or event, the incipit of the story provides a lot of valuable information that we need in order to fill the gaps of the story world. For example, we know that the story begins in the middle of a war that began in Europe in 1914, and that the Captain Little Hart's book, which actually truly exists, represents the version of the winners. We also know that during a war, narratives are often told by unreliable narrators, or based, more exactly, on unreliable sources, because they serve propaganda. So, all these pieces of information are important in order to understand the status of the fictional text, to infer correctly some of its implicit elements, and to interpret the text in a productive way. It is interesting to notice that Borges suggests that we should call the version of Captain Little Hart's version into question, because history books can never be considered as an exhaustive, completely reliable, and definitive version of what happened. Anyways, Borges adds a further level of complication between two versions of the same fact. In his deposition, Yutsun states that Runeberg had been arrested or murdered. But an editor's note comments, fictional editor's note, comments on this last hypothesis as follows. An hypothesis both hateful and odd. The Prussian spy, Hans Habner, alias Victor Runeberg, attacked with drawn automatic the bearer of the warrant for his arrest, Captain Richard Madden. The latter, in self-defense, inflicted the wound which brought about Runeberg's death. Okay, in this case, obviously, the editor seems to possess more information than the narrator. a fact that he proves by revealing the real name of his accomplice. So we must admit that Runeberg was probably killed and not arrested. But for the reader, there is still indeterminacy on how Runeberg was killed. The hypothetical version of Yutzun might be partial, but the editor's version could be manipulated by official sources, produced to discharge the agent by pleading self-defense. And I think that those two versions for the reader has the liberty to choose the fabula he wants, either self-defense or murder. And we see that no assertion, fictional or factual, can be considered as undisputed facts, even though some seem more reliable than others. Anyways, this last point illustrates a property of possible word semantics, the fact that in some cases it is possible to establish a hierarchy between opposite statements concerning the fabula, and in other cases we must accept the existence of multiple alternative worlds, because we are not able to reduce them to one reliable version. This plurality of worlds can also be related to the history of the narrative forms. As stated by Françoise Lavocat, si l'œuvre stipule bien des mondes possibles, leurs modalités d'engendrement et leur configuration diffèrent selon les périodes historiques. And Hilary Dannenberg, on the same line, suggests that analysis of the historical development of plot shows how, with the rise of the novel, more sophisticated plots develop involving the temporal orchestration of alternate possible world versions. More than one version of the past or future is suggested as a possibility by the text. And I think here we find some concerns we had during these 2 days about contextualizing the analysis in history, and also giving a room for unnatural fictions, and that one that challenge this idea of possible worlds. So we could state the indeterminacy found in Borges' story partly results from the consequence of the fact that it was written in the middle of the 20th century, that it is a parody of the paranoid genre of spy stories. Indeed, Dannenberg adds that fictional genre across the board, whether realist, semi-realist, fantasy, science fiction, or anti-realist, metafictional, all use alternate possible words, but with differing forms of ontological hierarchy. Here again, I want to stress that at this level, we are just concerned with the possible world asserted by the fiction, or problematically asserted by the fiction. Worlds that can be multiple or single, indeterminate or finite, indecisive or hierarchical. Either we compare the fiction with an external referent, namely the infinite possibilities, but also the uncountable constraints of the real world, or we aim to contrast different versions of the same fact inside the possible world of the fiction. And in the whole process, either we find a clear hierarchy between the alternatives or we don't. Now I'll try to be more specific on the nature of other kind of virtualities that can be actualized implicitly or explicitly by narrative fictions. The first kind I shall comment on, and probably the most obvious one from the formalist perspective, is the explicit description by narratives of events that don't belong to the fabula. In 1988, Gerald Prince introduced the category of the disnarrated in order to deal with this narrative modality that departs from mere assertions. Prince defines it as follows. The category of the disnarrated covers all the events that did not happen, but nonetheless are referred to in a negative or hypothetical mode by the narrative text. Here we see that we are dealing with virtualities that fully belong to the narrative discourse. The fundamental criteria are based on the explicit nature of the virtuality and the non-assertive mood of the discourse. So the disnarrated can be either an unrealized possibility imagined by a character, so belonging to the fabula, B, a forking path in the realm of the possible outlined by the narrator, or C, Prince mentions narrative possibility that was not chosen by the creator of the textual universe, but it is still mentioned by some authorial voice, if it exists. So we can find two of these narrations, both actualized by the main character in the story of Borges. The first one expresses a false guess concerning the antagonist. The other is a hope concerning the future. So we read, for instance, I thought that Richard Madden in some way had perpetrated my desperate plan. Very quickly, I understood that was impossible. So we have a statement that is actually mentioning something that doesn't exist. And the other one, I told myself that the duel had already begun and that I had won the first encounter by frustrating even for 40 minutes, even if by a stroke of fate, the attack of my adversary. And then we have this narration. I argued that this slightest of victories foreshadowed a total victory. I argued, no less fallaciously, that my cowardly felicity proved that I was a man capable of carrying out the adventure successfully. In both cases, we see an important discrepancy between the hope of the character and the knowledge expressed by the narrator, because it's also a character narrator, since the latter knows retrospectively that things will end up tragically. But the narrator can also express his opinion about alternatives in the past, like in the following statement, Madden's presence in Victor Huneberg's apartment meant the end of our anxieties and, but it seemed, or should have seemed very secondary to me, also the end of our lives. Okay, now let's switch to a different way of dealing with virtualities. They are more concerned about the logic of the fabula. Marie-Laure Ryan, in a book published in 1991, has proposed a different way of dealing with virtualities, and she's not concerned with the problem of describing all kinds of virtualities expressed by the narrative, discourse, but she tries to analyze the link between tellability of the fabula and its logical complexity. She says, tellability is rooted in conceptual and logical complexity, and the complexity of a plot depends on an underlying system of purely virtual embedded narratives. Embedded narratives are the story-like constructs contained in the private world of the characters. These constructs include not only the dreams, fictions, and fantasies conceived or told by the characters, but any kind of representation concerning past or future states or events, plans, passive projections, desires, beliefs. Among these embedded narratives, some reflect the event of the factual domain, while others delineate unactualized possibilities. So as summarized by Hilary Dannenberg, in contrast to Prince's theory, Ryan admits counterfactual worlds into this category only if they are product to the speculative activity of a character. And indeed, Ryan argues that the disnarrated produced by a narrator, for example, could be deleted from the text without consequence for the logical coherence of the narrative events, thus stressing more on the logic of the fabula and not of the discourse structures. But on the other hand, she includes things that were not in the approach of Prince, because implicit virtualities that must be reconstructed by the reader, for example, when the intention of a character is not specified, truly belongs to those virtualities. In the example already mentioned, Yutsun makes a supposition concerning the past based on information that he just received. Madden's presence in Victor Huneberg's meant that Huneberg had been arrested or murdered. These suppositions, even if they are proven to be false, are extremely important to understand the course of the narration, since the future actions of the protagonist are based on this diagnosis concerning the past. Second example shows an explicit intention, the narrator explaining that it is not going to be followed by action. He said, something made me look through my pockets. I found what I knew I would find, the American watch, the nickel chain, and the square coin, the key ring with the incriminating useless keys of Huneberg's apartment, a notebook, a letter which I resolved to destroy immediately and which I did not destroy. The last example refers more explicitly to a plan that is mentioned as a planification, but it is not mentioned explicitly. Yeah. We read, "My human voice was very weak. How might I make it carry to the ear of the chief? Vaguely I thought that a pistol report can be heard at a great distance. In 10 minutes, my plan was perfected." But at this stage of the story, the reader is not supposed to know what is going to be the plan. It is a twist at the end of the story. So the telephone book listed the name of the only person capable of transmitting the message, but we don't know yet how. And he lived in a suburb of Fenton, less than a half-hour's train ride away. So in distinguishing tellability from strategic point, Ryan highlights the difference between the narrative interest that relies on the complexity of the plan devised by the character and the interest that relies on the fact that this plan is momentarily unclear for the reader. So this is what is going to help us to go to the next stage that makes a whole difference. And she says, narrative suspense derives, for instance, from the confrontation of characters of limited foresight and reader who anticipates, correctly or not, the situation into which they should run. We could discuss this definition of suspense, but it's not the case here. The reverse strategy is also an efficient way to capture the reader's interest, delaying the reader's understanding of a sequence of actions by preventing access to the set of embedded narratives that motivate the agent. While the plot sets up a field of possibilities, the strategies of narrative discourse may guide the reader along certain paths. So we have to separate what belongs to the tellability rooted to the complexity of the fabula and what is going to be the strategic discourse. So here we go to the next stage, and namely to try to understand what are the virtualities shaped by the readers. And in this perspective, the new focus will be specifically on the gaps of the narrative, which elicit the active participation of the interpreter by making what Umberto Eco called inferential walks into the woods of the fiction, which is actually a good idea of what's the connection between a story, a plot, and a maze. Okay. So, several narratologists have distinguished two different narrative interests according to the temporal orientation of the virtual scenarios shaped by the reader. I could quote Sternberg, but actually some 10 years before in France, 1966, Todorov has identified two basic tendencies within the genre of detective fiction. The whodunit provokes curiosity about the past, and the thriller creates suspense about the future. This distinction can be generalized far beyond the scope of detective fictions, as actually Todorov explicitly said in his article. And Dannenberg argues that complex novels involve the interweaving of possible versions of both past and future worlds. Along the same line, authors like Meir Sternberg, Peter Brooks, James Phelan, myself, others, have investigated the links between the affective engagement of the reader and the progression in the text, including the analysis of the strategies used to generate, I quote Phelan, generate, sustain, develop, and resolve readers' interest in narratives, and especially the investigation of to quote Sternberg this time, expositional modes and temporal ordering in fiction. Well, I don't have time here to discuss the huge differences between these authors, but I want to stress that their theories mostly limit their ambition to consider the relation between some narrative techniques and the two major kinds of anticipation they elicit in the reader, in the reading process, namely projection and retrospection, or what I call the prognosis and diagnosis. Other studies have taken a more adventurous path, and I tried myself to take this dangerous path, by trying to provide description of how prospection and retrospection are actually transformed into concrete hypothetical scenarios by readers, indeed by interpreters. Indeed, in 1979, Umberto Eco had opened this vast field of investigation by linking the inferential works of the readers with the modal logic, Pearson's semiotics, and the more general notion of encyclopedia. More recently, Bertrand Gervais in French narratology and David Herman, among others, have used cognitive models developed especially in AI studies to describe how our knowledge about the logic of actions can shape our interpretation of a narrative. Among these skills, we find notions like scripts that I heard a lot during those 2 days, and the schematization of intentional actions. According to these studies, the tellability of a story relies on a destabilization of a stereotyped situation that can be described with a script, and its development involves the attempt to realize a planned action. So in our case, Yutsun, after being uncovered, must leave his deadly routine as a spy, but it's a routine anyway, and the story develops according to a double intentional path. The first path, seemingly impossible, aims to escape from the deadly chase of Captain Madden, and the second path, that will be successful, is to convey a secret information to a distant recipient. In other models, some authors have stressed more on the intertextual knowledge orienting the inferential works of the readers. Among them, John Peer wrote an article where he discussed specifically the intertextual frames that provide configurations that serve to build abduction concerning the past or the future or the present of the fabula. So we see with this path that actually also about contextualizing narratology. This time we have a contextualization by including to this discussion on virtualities the problem of the competencies of the readers that might change over time, that might not be so homogeneous. In our case, again, as a genre spy story provides useful configurations, helping us to anticipate the virtualities of the narrative, or just to understand it. For example, we recognize that the transmission of a secret is actually, and the chase sequence, are stereotypes that we usually find in this genre. And we can refer to previous fictions, intertextual knowledge, configurations, in order to shape our hypothesis about the conflict that may develop or be resolved in some directions. But we have to add that the genre or intertextual knowledge also generates a multiplicity of virtualities, since stereotypical stories involve a paranoid assumption that no one should be trusted and that the final resolution must be, hopefully, an unexpected one. I must indicate one last point concerning these virtualities that are being actualized by the readers. As Ryan puts it, even after the possible has been exhausted by the actualization of certain course of action, the interpreter revisits, or is free to revisit mentally the paths that have fallen into the domain of the counterfactual, so to assess the ethical or strategic decisions of the characters as well as the aesthetic decisions of the author. So because those ideas about virtualities shaped by readers are closely linked to the idea of a progression in the text and virginal reading, but actually we can still think about those in the act of rereading. So here in this story, in an involuntary ironical statement, Dr. Albert says, "Time forks perpetually." Okay, I have 5 minutes, and then I just switch to very fast to a last way of dealing with virtualities that seems also very predictive. Dealing with the virtualities of the text can also be done in a very uncooperative way. Marc Escola sees the possibility of a new kind of critique called critique interventionniste, the interfering critique, inspired by the works of Pierre Bayard, an author who wrote academic bestsellers such as Sherlock Holmes Was Wrong or How to Improve Failed Literary Works. Here he says, like, les contributeurs de cette théorie des textes possibles ont retenu de l'idée de Pierre Bayard, l'idée qu'un lecteur n'est nullement tenu d'adopter les conclusions auxquelles l'auteur prétend s'arrêter, que la critique littéraire peut donc être la continuation de la création par d'autres moyens, et qu'en définitive, il n'y a jamais bien loin de la lecture d'une œuvre à sa réinvention ou réfection. We can apply this theory of the possible text to the story of Borges in different ways, but very quickly. The first one, in the first 2 pages, we read that the first 2 pages of the deposition are missing. Well, we can guess what was this hidden part of the story that probably would shed a new light on the whole issues. We can also completely rewrite the story because we could be surprised that actually a victim chosen at random in a telephone book turns out to be linked to the killer in a very surprising way. So it's very unlikely. We could work on a more credible scenario from that. Well, conclusion. Is contemporary narratology a garden of forking paths too? Now it's time to conclude, and as I tried to show, research on narrative virtualities appears itself as a garden of forking paths. What looked at first sight like a single problem has produced, in fact, a lot of distinct and sometimes opposed theories. Nevertheless, in some works, we can observe a kind of continuity with narrative history. By expanding on the notion of fabula, Ryan has only added to its complexity by exploring the narrative, the virtualities shaped by the characters. And we can also consider Prince's theory of the disnarration as a mere expansion of the taxonomy of narrative figures developed by Jeannette. On the other hand, many works dealing with virtualities, including Ryan's, have crossed an additional threshold by trying to link narrative structures to the function they play in the discursive interaction. Here, 2 attitudes are possible. The first, advocated by James Phelan, is to admit that from a rhetorical perspective, we are dealing with some kind of authorial audience, one that realizes the intention of an implied author. In this case, there is no reason to turn our back to the previous perspectives because all virtualities that belong to the logic of the fabula or explicited by the narrative discourse must shape in some ways the inferences of this ideal audience. But we must add that these perspectives, But the second attitude would be to focus on empirical and audiences, and the clash with old paradigm would appear more obvious, as stated by Michael Toulan. The difficult and interesting question is not whether readers experience surprise, evasion, predictability, and so on, but pinpointing the condition generalizable beyond a case-by-case annotation conducive to those conditions. Are the conditions specifiable in formal terms at all? And that's, I think, a very open question. Some 30 years ago, Herman recalled that Shlomit Raymond Cannon expressed the hope that deconstruction, at that time a comparatively new development of the theoretical scene, might enrich narrative theory rather than render it obsolete. I think that 30 years later, while post-classical studies have embraced new perspectives far beyond the mere description of formal attributes, the trench between 2 major currents of narrative theories still depends on how we deal with the challenge of deconstruction. And so, after all, is contemporary narratology entering a period of consolidation? My opinion is that it all depends on the way we look at the garden. What I would call our narratological posture. In the first case, we can have a global look at the garden as a whole, and of course, each part of the garden, the kind of virtualities we are dealing with, look quite different. But it is possible to admit that these different paths are complementary perspectives on a complex issue. From this standpoint, we want to take a long walk to explore every corner of the garden, and we can draw a map to see where we come from and have an idea of the regions that still need to be explored. This is a posture adopted by some authors, like Hilary Dannenberg, for example, when she's asking for, still waiting for a comprehensive model of the counterfactual in fiction. And then, okay, that's really unfortunate because I don't want to cut Meir Sternberg because he could be upset with me. But okay, there are, I think, other people that would just like say that it's an either-or choice, and that's if we really take seriously the question of the role of empirical reader, I think we have a bit more complications. Okay, thank you. Sorry for being too long.